10 years is a long time to forget how to smile. 10 years is enough to turn a man into stone, to hollow out everything soft inside him until only the hard edges remain. Dominic Castellano had spent every single one of those 3,650 days building walls so high that no one could see over them. He had convinced himself that this was strength, that numbness was the same as survival, that a man who felt nothing could never be hurt again. He was wrong, but he would not discover that until the night his driver took a wrong turn on a rain-soaked street in Brooklyn, and Dominic found himself staring at a flower shop window that would change everything. The evening had started like every other evening in his carefully controlled existence. A meeting at his restaurant in Tribeca with associates from the construction unions. Numbers discussed, agreements reached, hands shaken with the firm grip of men who understood the weight of their words. Dominic had listened, more than he spoke, which was his way. He had learned long ago that power resided not in the loudest voice but in the most patient silence. Let other men fill the air with their ambitions and their fears. He would watch. He would wait. He would decide. By 10 o'clock, the meeting was finished, and Dominic declined the invitation to continue the evening at a club downtown. He was 53 years old and had no interest in the noise and the crowds and the desperate energy of people trying to feel alive. He had felt alive once. He had felt everything once. Now he preferred the quiet of his penthouse, the view of the city lights from his window, the glass of whiskey that helped him sleep without dreaming. His driver, a young man named Anthony, who had been with the family for 3 years, was navigating through a construction detour when the car came to a stop at an unfamiliar intersection. Dominic looked up from his phone and saw a street he did not recognize. Small shops with hand-painted signs, a bakery with a striped awning, a barber shop that looked like it had not changed since 1950, and on the corner, illuminated by a single lamp, a flower shop with a window display that made him lean forward in his seat. The flowers were arranged in a cascade of color that seemed impossible in the gray of the rainy night. Deep red roses tumbling over the edge of a vintage watering can, white peonies nestled against purple irises, yellow tulips standing tall in a brass bucket that caught the light and glowed like treasure. It was beautiful in a way that Dominic had stopped noticing beauty. It was alive in a way that made him suddenly aware of how dead he had become. He told Anthony to stop the car. The driver obeyed without question, though Dominic could see the confusion in his eyes through the rearview mirror. In 3 years of service, the boss had never once asked to stop for anything that was not business, but Anthony knew better than to ask questions. He pulled to the curb and waited. Dominic sat in the back seat and stared at the flower shop window. The rain had slowed to a mist that softened the edges of everything, turning the street into something from a painting. He could see a light on in the back of the shop, a warm yellow glow that suggested someone was still inside even at this late hour. He wondered who would be arranging flowers at 10:30 on a Wednesday night. He wondered why he cared. After several minutes, he told Anthony to drive on. But the next morning, Dominic found himself thinking about those flowers. He thought about them during his breakfast meeting with his accountant. He thought about them during his conference call with the lawyers, handling a property dispute in Queens. He thought about them during his afternoon workout in the private gym on the top floor of his building, where he pushed his body through the same routine he had followed for 30 years, maintaining the strength that had served him well in his younger days when disputes were settled with fists rather than phone calls. By evening, he had made a decision. He would go back. The flower shop was called Petals and Promises, according to the elegant script painted on the glass door. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building that looked like it had been standing since before the neighborhood had a name. The bell above the door chimed when Dominic entered, and he was immediately surrounded by fragrance. Not the artificial sweetness of department store perfume, but something real and complex. Earth and water and the green smell of growing things. The shop was small and crowded with blooms of every variety. Buckets lined the walls, each one filled with flowers in various stages of opening. There were coolers displaying pre-made arrangements and shelves stacked with vases and ribbons and cards. Somewhere in the back, a radio was playing something soft and classical. It felt like stepping into another world entirely. A woman emerged from behind a curtain, wiping her hands on an apron covered with soil and water stains. She was perhaps 45, with auburn hair pulled back in a loose knot and eyes the color of spring leaves. There were freckles across her nose and smile lines at the corners of her mouth, the kind that came from years of genuine happiness rather than polite pretense. She looked at Dominic with friendly curiosity, clearly not recognizing him, clearly not caring about the expensive cut of his suit or the watch on his wrist that cost more than most people earned in a year. She asked if she could help him find something. Dominic realized that he had not thought this through. He had no reason to be here, no occasion that required flowers, no one to give them to. His wife had been dead for 10 years. His mother had passed 5 years before that. He had no siblings, no children, no one in his life who would appreciate a bouquet of roses or a vase of lilies. He heard himself say that he needed flowers for a grave. The woman's expression softened immediately. She nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world and began moving through the shop, gathering stems from various buckets. She asked him about the person he had lost, not in a prying way, but with the gentle professionalism of someone who had helped many grieving people choose flowers for their beloved dead. He told her that it was his wife, that she had died in an accident 10 years ago, that he had not visited her grave in a very long time. The woman paused in her gathering and looked at him with something that was not quite pity, but was close. She said that grief had no timeline, that it took as long as it took, that the fact that he was here now, ready to bring flowers, meant something important. Dominic did not know what to say to that. He was not accustomed to strangers offering him emotional insight. He was not accustomed to kindness that asked nothing in return. She finished the arrangement in silence, her hands moving, with practiced grace as she combined white roses with eucalyptus and baby's breath. The result was simple and elegant, the kind of thing his wife would have loved. His wife who had filled their home with fresh flowers every week, who had known the names of every bloom in every garden, who had tried for years to teach him the difference between a peony and a ranunculus. When the woman told him the price, he paid without negotiation and added a tip that made her eyes widen. She started to protest, but something in his expression stopped her. She simply thanked him and handed over the wrapped bouquet, and as he turned to leave, she called out after him. She said that her name was Eleanor Mitchell and that she hoped to see him again. Dominic stopped with his hand on the door. Elena. His wife's name had been Elena. He turned back and looked at this woman, this stranger who had shown him unexpected kindness on an ordinary evening, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been sealed shut for 10 years, something that hurt and terrified him, and also impossibly felt like the beginning of healing. He told her that his name was Dominic. Then he walked out into the night. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, take a moment right now to subscribe, because the story you just heard is only the beginning, and what comes next will remind you why we never truly stop hoping for love. Elena Mitchell had owned Petals and Promises for 17 years. She had bought the shop with the settlement money from her divorce, using every penny to purchase the building and the inventory and the right to start over in a neighborhood where no one knew her history. She had been 28 years old, heartbroken and determined, convinced that if she could just surround herself with beautiful things, she might eventually feel beautiful again. It had taken time, years of early mornings and late nights, of learning the business through trial and error, of building relationships with suppliers and customers and the other small business owners on the block. Years of therapy and self-help books, and the slow, painful work of understanding why she had stayed so long in a marriage that had made her small. But eventually she had found her footing. She had found herself. She had built a life that was entirely her own, filled with flowers and friendships and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. She had also decided, somewhere, along the way, that romantic love was not for her. It was not bitterness that led to this conclusion, it was practicality. She had tried love once, and it had nearly destroyed her. Not physically, though her ex-husband had come close a few times, but emotionally, spiritually, in all the ways that took the longest to heal. She had given herself completely to a man who did not deserve her, and the process of reclaiming herself had been so difficult that she never wanted to risk losing herself again. So she dated occasionally, but never seriously. She enjoyed the company of men without allowing them into her heart. She told herself that she was happy, and most days she even believed it. Then the man in the expensive suit walked into her shop. There was something about him that she could not identify, a heaviness in his eyes that spoke of losses she could only imagine, a stillness in his body that suggested great strength held carefully in check. When he told her about his wife, about the accident, about the 10 years of avoiding her grave, Eleanor had felt her professional detachment slip. She had wanted to reach out and touch his hand, to offer comfort that went beyond the appropriate boundaries of florist and customer. She had not, of course. She had maintained her composure, made the arrangement, accepted his payment. But after he left, she had stood in the empty shop for a long time, thinking about the way he had said his name. Dominic. She wondered if she would ever see him again. The answer came 3 days later, when he appeared at her door just as she was closing for the evening. He looked different this time, less formal, in a dark sweater and slacks instead of a suit. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. He asked if she had time for a cup of coffee. Eleanor should have said no. She had rules about this sort of thing. She did not socialize with customers, especially male customers who looked at her the way this man was looking at her, but something about the vulnerability in his posture, the hesitation in his voice made her set aside her rules. She said yes. They walked to a cafe down the street, a small place that Eleanor frequented on her breaks. The owner knew her by name and brought her usual order without asking. Dominic ordered black coffee and sat across from her in a booth by the window, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he told her that he had visited his wife's grave for the first time in 8 years. He said that he had placed the flowers on the headstone and stood there for nearly an hour, not speaking, not praying, just being present in a way he had avoided for so long. He said that something had shifted inside him during that hour. Something that had been frozen for a decade had begun to thaw. He said that he thought it had started in her flower shop. Elena did not know how to respond. She was not accustomed to being credited with transformative moments in strangers' lives. She wrapped her hands around her teacup and listened as he continued to speak, telling her about his wife, about the life they had built together, about the future they had planned that had been erased in an instant on a rainy highway. His wife had been pregnant when she died, 7 months along. A boy. They had decided to name him Marco, after Dominic's grandfather. In a single moment, he had lost his wife, his son, and every dream he had ever had about the kind of man he might become. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached across the table and took his hand without thinking, a gesture of pure human compassion that surprised them both. His fingers were warm and rough, the hands of a man who had worked hard at some point in his life, even if that work was now done by others on his behalf. He looked at their joined hands and did not pull away. They talked until the cafe closed, then walked back to her shop, where his driver was waiting in a black car that looked like it belonged in a movie. Dominic asked if he could see her again, not as a customer this time, just as a person who had found something in her presence that he had not felt in a very long time. Eleanor heard herself say yes. Over the following weeks, they developed a pattern. He would come to her shop in the evenings after she had closed for the day, and they would walk through the neighborhood together. Sometimes they stopped for dinner at the Italian place on the corner. Sometimes they just walked, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories one piece at a time. She told him about her marriage, about the man who had seemed charming and attentive until the wedding ring was on her finger, and who had then slowly revealed his true nature. She told him about the years of walking on eggshells, of never knowing which version of her husband would come home each night. She told him about the day she finally left, the terror and the freedom, the long road, back to herself. He told her about his business, though he was careful about the details. He said that he was in construction and restaurants, which was true as far as it went. He said that he had inherited certain responsibilities from his father, which was also true. He did not tell her about the other aspects of his life, the ones that required men with hard eyes and no questions. He was not ready for that conversation. He was not sure he ever would be. But as the weeks became months, Dominic found himself wanting to tell her everything. The weight of his secrets had never bothered him before. He had carried them with the same stoic acceptance with which he carried everything else. But now, sitting across from Eleanor in restaurants and cafes, watching her laugh at his terrible jokes, feeling her hand in his as they walked through the park, he wanted to be fully known. He wanted someone to see all of him, even the darkness, and choose to stay anyway. He was falling in love. The realization hit him one evening as he watched her close up the shop, moving through the familiar routine with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. She was humming something under her breath, a song he did not recognize, and the lamplight caught the red in her hair and turned it to copper. She looked up and caught him staring, and instead of looking away, he held her gaze. She smiled, and Dominic Castellano, who had not smiled in 10 years, who had forgotten what happiness felt like, who had convinced himself that his heart was as dead as his wife and unborn son, felt the corners of his mouth turn upward in response. It was a small thing. It was everything. The first time Dominic kissed Elena, they were standing in the back room of her shop, surrounded by buckets of flowers waiting to be arranged. She was showing him how to strip the thorns from a rose without damaging the stem, a skill she said every person should possess. And when he inevitably pricked his finger, she had taken his hand to examine the tiny wound. Their eyes met. The distance between them disappeared. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people who had been hurt before and were afraid of being hurt again. But it was also inevitable, the natural culmination of weeks of conversation and connection and carefully managed proximity. When they finally pulled apart, Elena was trembling slightly, and Dominic realized that his heart was beating faster than it had in years. She asked him what this meant. He said that he did not know, but he knew that he did not want it to stop. They began seeing each other more openly after that. Dinners at restaurants where Dominic was known, which meant that word would inevitably spread through his organization that the boss had a woman. She met his driver, Anthony, who was unfailingly polite and also clearly suspicious of anyone who might pose a threat to his employer. She met some of his associates at business events where she served as his date. Elegant men and women who treated her with the careful respect that suggested Dominic had made his expectations clear. But she had not yet learned the full truth of who he was. That revelation came on a night in early spring, when Elena was working late to finish arrangements for a wedding the next day. The shop was quiet, the radio playing softly in the background, when she heard voices outside, raised voices, angry and threatening, followed by the sound of something breaking. She moved to the window and saw Dominic on the sidewalk with 3 other men. 2 of them she recognized from the events they had attended together. The third was a stranger, a younger man, with fear etched across his face. The 2 associates were holding him by the arms, while Dominic spoke to him in a voice too low to hear through the glass. Then Dominic struck the man across the face. Elena felt the breath leave her body. She watched as the young man crumpled as the associates dragged him to a car waiting at the curb. As Dominic stood alone on the sidewalk, straightening his cuffs with the calm of someone adjusting his tie before a meeting. He looked up at her window as if he could feel her watching, and even from this distance, she could see the hardness in his expression. He turned and walked away. Elena did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment above the shop, running through every conversation they had ever had, every moment they had shared, trying to reconcile the gentle man who held her hand and talked about his dead wife with the man who had struck another person without hesitation or remorse. By morning, she had made a decision. She needed to know the truth. Dominic arrived at his usual time that evening, and Elena met him at the door with an expression that stopped him in his tracks. She led him inside, locked the door behind them, and told him what she had seen. He did not deny it. He stood in the middle of her shop, surrounded by flowers that suddenly seemed to mock the violence she now knew he was capable of, and he told her everything. He told her about his family, the Castellano organization that had controlled parts of Brooklyn and Queens for 4 generations. He told her about his father, who had built an empire through a combination of legitimate business and activities that existed outside the law. He told her about inheriting that empire at 30 years old, younger than he should have been, because his father's heart had given out without warning. He told her about the choices he had made since then, the compromises, the things that could not be undone. Elena listened in silence. When he finished speaking, she asked him about the man on the sidewalk. Who was he? What had he done? Dominic said that the man had been stealing from one of the restaurants, skimming from the cash register for months. That kind of betrayal could not go unpunished, not in his world. If word spread that Dominic Castellano let people take what was his without consequence, everything he had built would begin to crumble. Elena asked if the man was dead. No. Dominic said that he had been given a choice: leave the city and never return, or face more serious consequences. He had chosen to leave. Elena turned away and stared at the wall of coolers, at the roses and lilies and carnations waiting for customers who would never know the truth about the woman who arranged them. She thought about her own past, her own choices, the years she had spent with a man who had seemed so different in the beginning. She thought about how easy it was to be fooled by charm and kindness, how quickly gentleness could become something else. But she also thought about the past months, the way Dominic looked at her, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he had never once made her feel small or afraid, had never raised his voice or his hand, had treated her with a respect that her ex-husband had never shown. She turned back to face him. She said that she needed time. Time to think, to process, to decide if this was something she could live with. Dominic nodded. He said that he understood. He said that whatever she decided, he would respect it. He said that he would stay away until she was ready, and that if she was never ready, he would learn to accept that too. He left without another word. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Elena's life since her divorce. She went through the motions of running her shop, serving customers, creating arrangements for birthdays and anniversaries and funerals. But her mind was elsewhere, constantly circling back to Dominic, to the impossible choice that lay before her. Could she love a man who lived in darkness? Could she walk away from the only person who had made her feel truly alive in 17 years? Now pause for a moment and leave a comment with these words. Love sometimes asks us to see the light in someone everyone else calls darkness, because that is what Elena was facing. And her answer would change everything. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Eleanor called Dominic and asked him to come to the shop. He arrived within the hour, looking worse than she had ever seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and anxious days. He stood in the doorway like a man awaiting a verdict, and in a way, that was exactly what he was doing. Elena told him to sit down. She had spent the past 3 weeks doing research, reading everything she could find about organized crime, about the families that operated in New York, about the specific history of the Castellano organization. She had learned things that disturbed her deeply, but she had also learned things that surprised her: the legitimate businesses that employed hundreds of people, the scholarships funded in communities that had no other options, the protection offered to shop owners who might otherwise be at the mercy of predators far worse than Dominic, and his associates. It was not a defense. She was not naive enough to believe that good deeds could erase bad ones. But it was context. It was complexity. It was the understanding that the world he inhabited was not black and white, and that the man sitting across from her could not be reduced to a single moment on a sidewalk. She told him that she was not going to pretend she was comfortable with what she had learned. She told him that there would be boundaries, lines she would not cross, aspects of his life she could not participate in or even acknowledge. She told him that if he ever lied to her, if he ever put her in danger without her knowledge, if he ever raised his hand to her the way her ex-husband had, she would be gone before he could blink. Then she told him that she loved him. She had not meant to say it. The words escaped before she could stop them, propelled by weeks of loneliness and longing and the simple truth that she missed him in ways she had not thought possible. She watched his face as the words landed, watched the walls he had built over 10 years crack and crumble, watched something that might have been hope kindle in his eyes. He crossed the space between them and took her in his arms. He said that he loved her too, that he had loved her since the first night he walked into her shop, since she looked at him without fear or deference, since she treated him like a man instead of a myth. He said that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her. She told him that he already was. The months that followed were a careful navigation of two worlds. Elena kept her shop, her independence, her life outside of Dominic's organization. He kept her separate from the business, introducing her to associates only in social contexts, never discussing the details of his work when they were together. It was not a perfect arrangement. There were questions she learned not to ask. There were evenings when he disappeared without explanation and returned with shadows in his eyes that spoke of things she could not imagine. But there was also joy, more joy than Elena had experienced in her entire adult life. They traveled together when his schedule allowed. A week in Paris, where he showed her the gardens that his mother had loved. A long weekend in San Francisco, walking through the flower markets of Chinatown and eating dim sum in restaurants where the menus had no English translation. A trip to Florence, where he bought her a gold bracelet from a family of jewelers who had been crafting precious metals for 500 years. He met her sister, a schoolteacher in New Jersey, who was initially suspicious of this wealthy older man who had appeared in Elena's life. But Dominic was patient and charming, and by the end of the first dinner her sister was laughing at his jokes and pressing her for details about when they would make things official. Elena had not thought about making things official. She was content with what they had, the easy rhythm of their days together, the knowledge that someone was waiting for her at the end of each shift. But Dominic had other ideas. On the 1-year anniversary of their first meeting, he arrived at the shop with a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus and baby's breath, the same arrangement she had made for his wife's grave, the flowers that had started everything. He set them on the counter and took both her hands in his, and he asked her to marry him. Eleanor stared at him, at the hope and fear mingled in his expression, at the ring box he had produced from his pocket, at the diamond that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the wall. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the complications, the dangers, the fundamental incompatibility of a florist and a crime boss. She thought about the life she had built for herself, the independence she had fought so hard to achieve, the peace she had finally found after years of chaos. Then she thought about the past year, the laughter, the conversations, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen, the way he had learned to smile again, and how she had been the one to teach him. She said yes. The wedding was small, just family and a handful of close friends, held in a garden at a venue upstate where the flowers were so spectacular that Elena kept stopping to examine them with professional interest. She wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet. She had arranged herself. Dominic wore a grey suit and an expression of such profound happiness that several of his associates later admitted they had not recognized him at first. They exchanged vows in the golden light of late afternoon, promising to love and honor and cherish, promising to stand by each other through whatever the future might bring. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Dominic kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache, and somewhere in the crowd, she heard her sister crying. The reception lasted until midnight, all dancing and champagne and toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the evening wore on. Elena danced with her new husband, with her brother-in-law, with Anthony the driver, who turned out to be surprisingly graceful on his feet. She ate cake and laughed and felt, for perhaps the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, as they lay together in the suite that had been prepared for them, Dominic told her that he wanted to give her a wedding gift, something that would change both their lives. He was going to step back from the organization. Not entirely, he said quickly, seeing the surprise on her face. That was not possible, not with his level of involvement. But he had been training his underboss for years, preparing him for eventual succession. It was time to accelerate that process, time to hand over the daily operations, the difficult decisions, the parts of his life That could not exist alongside the man he wanted to become. Elena asked him if he was sure, if he was doing this for her or for himself. He said that he was doing it for them, for the future they could build together, for the chance to wake up every morning without the weight of an empire on his shoulders. She kissed him and told him that she was proud of him. And in the darkness of that room, with her husband's arms around her and the scent of flowers still clinging to her hair, Elena Mitchell, Castellano finally understood what it meant to be truly happy. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of adjustment and joy. Dominic kept his promise, gradually transferring responsibilities to his underboss and the council of advisors, who had been managing various aspects of the organization for years. It was not a clean break, nothing in his world ever was, but it was progress. Tangible, measurable progress toward a life that looked more like retirement than empire. They bought a house in Westchester, a sprawling property with gardens that made Eleanor's professional heart sing. She spent weekends planning what would bloom where, imagining the colors that would paint the landscape in spring and summer and fall. Dominic watched her work with an expression of bemused contentment, occasionally offering to help and usually making things worse, which made them both laugh. She kept the flower shop, though she hired additional staff to handle the day-to-day operations. It was too much a part of her identity to abandon entirely. But she reduced her hours, allowed herself the luxury of time that had seemed impossible when she was building the business alone. Time for travel, time for books she had always meant to read, time for the simple pleasure of waking up next to someone who loved her. There were challenges, of course, moments when Dominic's past intruded on their present, when phone calls came at odd hours and his expression went cold and distant. Moments when Eleanor wondered if she had made a mistake, if she was fooling herself about the possibility of change. But those moments passed. They always passed. And on the other side of them was always the man who had learned to smile again, the man who looked at her like she had hung the stars. On their first anniversary they returned to Paris, different hotel, different season, but the same magic that had enchanted them both the first time. They visited the gardens that Dominic had shown her the year before, now in full spring bloom, and walked along the Seine as the sun set over the city. They ate at tiny restaurants and drank wine on rooftop terraces and made love in the afternoon, with the windows open to let in the breeze. One evening, as they sat at a cafe watching the lights come on across the water, Dominic told Elena that he had something to say. He had been thinking about his legacy, about what he would leave behind when he was gone. For most of his life, that legacy had been the organization, the empire his father and grandfather had built and that he had expanded. But that legacy now belonged to others, the underboss, the council, the next generation who would carry it forward in whatever direction they chose. He wanted to build something different now, something that bore his name but served a different purpose. He wanted to create a foundation, a charitable organization that would fund scholarships and small business loans and community programs in the neighborhoods where he had grown up. He wanted to take the wealth he had accumulated through decades of work, both legitimate and otherwise, and use it to help people who had no other options. Elena stared at him across the table, her wine forgotten in her hand. He said that he knew it would not erase anything. It would not make up for the things he had done, the people he had hurt, the laws he had broken, but it might create some good in the world. It might leave something behind that his children, if they ever had children, could be proud of. Elena set down her wine and took his hands in hers. She said that she thought it was a beautiful idea, that she would help him in any way she could, that she was proud of him for even considering it, for wanting to be more than the sum of his past. Dominic looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something raw and vulnerable and almost young, like the boy he must have been before life and circumstance turned him into what he had become. He said that he could not have imagined any of this a year ago, that she had changed everything, that loving her had shown him parts of himself he had forgotten existed. Elena leaned across the table and kissed him. The foundation launched 6 months later, funded with an initial endowment that made headlines in the financial press. Dominic had chosen not to use his own name. Too many complications, too many questions. Instead, it was named after his wife and son, the Elena and Marco Castellano Foundation, a tribute to the family he had lost and the future he had never had. The first scholarships were awarded to students from Brooklyn and Queens, young people who reminded Dominic of himself at that age, hungry and ambitious and desperate for a chance. He attended the ceremony where the checks were presented, standing in the back of the room and watching as lives were changed by a simple piece of paper with his signature on it. Elena stood beside him, her hand in his. She asked him how he felt. He said that he felt for the first time in a very long time like he might actually be a good man. The years that followed were the happiest of Dominic Castellano's life. He and Elena divided their time between the house in Westchester and the apartment they kept in the city, close to her flower shop and the restaurants he still owned. They traveled extensively, chasing spring around the world, visiting gardens and greenhouses and markets, where Eleanor filled her suitcase with seeds and bulbs and cuttings that would eventually bloom in their backyard. The foundation grew beyond their initial expectations. What had started as a scholarship program expanded to include job training, housing assistance, and a network of small business loans that helped dozens of entrepreneurs get their start. Dominic found himself spending more and more time on foundation business, meeting with community leaders and potential donors and the young people whose lives were being transformed. It was work that satisfied him in a way that running the organization never had. It was work that allowed him to sleep peacefully at night. Elena's flower shop celebrated its 20th anniversary with a party that spilled onto the sidewalk and down the block. The neighborhood had changed since she first arrived, gentrifying in ways that made her nostalgic for the old days, but her shop remained an anchor, a place where everyone was welcome, where the flowers were always fresh, where the woman behind the counter remembered your name and your grandmother's birthday, and the kind of arrangement you liked best. Dominic stood at the edge of the party, watching his wife move through the crowd, accepting hugs and compliments, and the affection of people who had known her for 2 decades. She caught his eye and smiled, that same smile that had first made him feel like he might actually be alive, and he felt his heart expand with a love that still surprised him after all these years. They were 62 and 60 years old. They had been married for 7 years, and somehow, impossibly, they were still falling in love. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of their Westchester house, watching the fireflies dance across the lawn, Elena told Dominic that she wanted to do something special for their 8th anniversary, something that would celebrate how far they had come and acknowledge how far they still had to go. She wanted them to renew their vows. Not a big ceremony, she said quickly, just the 2 of them. Maybe in Italy at one of those little chapels in the hills that they had visited on their travels, a private moment to recommit to each other and to the life they had built together. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he had a better idea. 2 months later, they stood in the garden of the house in Westchester, surrounded by every flower that Elena had planted over the years. Her sister was there, older now but still crying at weddings. Anthony was there, along with several of the associates who had become something like family over the years. The recipients of the foundation's first scholarships were there, successful professionals now, who had driven hours to witness this moment. The officiant was a priest who had known the Castellano family for decades, who had baptized Dominic as an infant and married his parents and buried both of them when their time came. He spoke about love that endures, about partnerships that grow, stronger with time, about the miracle of 2 people finding each other in a world designed to keep them apart. When it was Dominic's turn to speak, he took Elena's hands and looked into her eyes. He said that he had been dead for 10 years before she brought him back to life, that she had taught him how to smile, how to hope, how to believe that even the darkest soul could find its way toward the light. He said that every good thing in his life, every moment of peace, every morning he woke up, grateful to be alive, was because of her. Elena was crying by the time he finished. She reached up and touched his face, the face that had become more precious to her than any flower she had ever grown, and she told him that she loved him. She told him that she would always love him. The priest pronounced them married again, and they kissed as the sun set over the garden that Elena had built. painting the flowers in shades of gold and rose. The guests applauded, and the fireflies began their evening dance, and somewhere in the house, a phone rang with business that would have to wait. That night, long after the guests had gone and the garden had fallen silent, Dominic and Elena lay in their bed and talked about the future, about the years they still had ahead of them, about the trips they wanted to take and the projects they wanted to complete, and the grandnieces and nephews who would someday play in their garden. Elena asked him if he had any regrets. Dominic thought about the question for a long time. Then he said that he regretted the years he had spent closed off from life, the decade of numbness that had followed his first wife's death, the walls he had built that had nearly prevented him from recognizing love when it walked into his world wearing an apron and carrying a bucket of roses. But he did not regret the path that had led him here, because that path, with all its darkness and all its pain, had eventually led to her. Elena kissed him and told him that she did not regret anything either. Outside their window, the garden slept under a blanket of stars. The flowers would bloom again tomorrow, as they always did, as they always would, for as long as there was someone to tend them. And inside the house, two people who had lost their way found peace at last. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of pretending that the past had never happened, but the peace of accepting it, learning from it, and choosing every single day to move toward the light. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And if you are not already subscribed, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Because there are many more stories like this, one waiting to be told, stories of hope and healing and the extraordinary power of love to transform even the darkest hearts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember that it is never too late to learn how to smile again. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected places.